The gray silk dress was the only thing of value she had left, and it was a lie. It clung to her, a whisper of a life that had evaporated in the harsh Nevada sunlight, its fine weave a cruel joke against the coarse dust of Redemption Gulch. The dress promised a future as a respectable wife, a cherished partner. But the man who had been her husband for less than a day was gone, vanished into the shimmering heat haze with the last of their shared money, leaving her on the splintered boardwalk in front of the land office with a void where her future was supposed to be. Her name was May, and she understood just enough of the agent's brusque English to know the marriage contract was void. The land claim her husband was meant to file, the one that was to be their foundation, was worthless. He had never owned it. She was alone, an ocean away from everything she had ever known, a silent figure in gray silk, surrounded by the cacophony of a language she could not speak. The town moved around her like a river around a stone. Men in sweat-stained hats paused to stare, their eyes lingering with a mixture of curiosity and calculation. Women in calico dresses pulled their children closer, their whispers like the rustle of dry leaves. She was an oddity, a piece of porcelain dropped in a blacksmith shop. And in the American West of 1878, an unescorted woman, especially one who looked as she did, was not just an oddity. She was an opportunity. Arthur Hayes saw it happen. He'd been inside the land office, arguing with a clerk about a disputed water right for his small horse ranch nestled in the hills outside of town. He was a quiet man, his face weathered by sun and wind into a map of patient labor. He spoke only when necessary, and preferred the company of his horses to that of most men. When he stepped outside, blinking in the glare, he saw her. She was standing perfectly still, her back ramrod straight, as if holding herself together by sheer force of will. He saw the predatory way Jedediah Sterling was watching her from across the street. Sterling owned the freight company, and it was said he owned half the town along with it. His smile was all teeth and finance, and the way he looked at the woman in the gray dress made something in Arthur's gut clench. Sterling started to cross the street, his two burly freight hands falling into step behind him. Arthur knew what would happen next. Sterling would offer assistance, a room at the boarding house he owned, a job in the laundry he controlled. The offer would be a cage disguised as a kindness. Arthur was not a man who interfered. He believed in minding his own fences, but he also believed in decency, a currency scarcer than water in Redemption Gulch. He moved before he had fully formed the thought. He stopped a few feet from her, careful not to crowd her space. He took off his hat, a gesture of respect that was startling in its sincerity. The dust motes danced in the sun between them. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and steady, not expecting her to understand the words so much as the tone. "Looks like you could use some help." May's eyes, which had been fixed on some distant point beyond the raw, unfinished buildings, slowly focused on him. She saw a man whose hands were calloused and marked by work, not by rings or soft living. His eyes were the color of the faded sky, and they held no trace of the avarice she saw in the others. Sterling and his men had paused, watching this unexpected interruption with amusement. Arthur ignored them. He knew he had to make his offer simple, direct, and unambiguous. He pointed a thumb over his shoulder toward the hills. "My place," he said slowly. "A room. Just a room. Safe." He didn't know if she understood, but he saw the flicker of comprehension, the desperate hope warring with deep-seated fear. Sterling chuckled, a sound like gravel turning in a bucket. "Well now, Hayes, playing the Good Samaritan? Don't you know charity begins at home?" Arthur didn't turn to look at him. His focus remained on May. He saw the way her hands were clenched at her sides, the knuckles white against the soft gray silk. She was terrified, but she was not broken. He had a choice. He could walk away, back to his horses and his quiet life, and leave her to the wolves. Or he could do this. He could step into trouble that was not his own. "I've got a spare room," he said again, this time more to himself than to her. It was a simple statement of fact. His cabin had 2 rooms. One was his. The other had been empty for 5 years, since his brother had left for Oregon. May looked from Arthur's earnest, sun-creased face to Sterling's predatory smirk. She had been sold once by her family, a transaction of hope and desperation. She had been betrayed by the man who was supposed to be her protector. Now 2 futures stood before her on a dusty street in a foreign land. One was a gilded cage. The other was an unknown quantity, a quiet man with honest eyes, offering nothing more than a door to close behind her. She took a single, deliberate step toward Arthur Hayes. It was the first choice she had truly made for herself in months. The whispers of the town followed them as he led her toward his wagon, a small island of quiet dignity in a sea of speculation. He did not yet know that this single act of decency would cost him nearly everything he had. The cabin was small, built of sturdy pine that had weathered to a soft silver. Inside it was spare but meticulously clean. A cast-iron stove stood against one wall, a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs in the center. A door led to a second, smaller room. Arthur pointed to it. "Yours," he said. May stepped inside. It contained a narrow cot with a neatly folded wool blanket, a small washstand with a pitcher and bowl, and a single window that looked out over a corral where 3 horses stood, swishing their tails in the afternoon heat. It was the plainest room she had ever seen, yet it felt like the grandest palace. It had a door that latched from the inside. For 2 days they lived in a shared, awkward silence. Arthur went about his chores, mending fences, tending to the horses, speaking to her only to offer food or point to the well. He moved with a deliberate economy, never wasting a motion or a word. May stayed inside mostly, the gray dress feeling more and more like a costume. She found a broom and swept the cabin floor until it was spotless. She washed the few dishes they used and set them to dry. They communicated through gestures and the slow, careful pronunciation of single words. Water. Bread. Thank you. She learned the rhythm of his life. He rose before the sun, his movements quiet so as not to wake her. He returned at midday, his shirt damp with sweat, to eat a piece of bread and cheese in silence. He worked again until dusk, the setting sun casting his long shadow across the yard. He was a man rooted to this small patch of earth, his existence a cycle of hard work and solitude. She was a disruption, a foreign element he had introduced into his own ordered world, and she did not yet understand why. The disruption arrived in a cloud of dust on the 3rd day. Jedediah Sterling rode up to the edge of Arthur's property on a fine black horse, his 2 hired men flanking him. Arthur was in the corral, working with a young colt on a lead rope. He saw them coming and a cold, hard knot formed in his stomach. He looped the rope over the fence post and walked to the edge of his land, stopping just inside his own property line. "Hayes!" Sterling called out, his voice carrying an easy authority. He didn't dismount. "I've come for my property." "There's nothing here that belongs to you, Sterling," Arthur said, his voice level. Sterling laughed. "The Chinese woman. Her passage from San Francisco was arranged on my company's credit. Her intended, a worthless gambler named Finn, signed a contract making her collateral against the debt. He defaulted when he skipped town. Therefore, she belongs to me until the debt is paid." The words hit Arthur like a physical blow. Consignment. Collateral. Sterling spoke of her as if she were a barrel of flour. "She's a person, not a piece of freight," Arthur said, the anger a low burn in his chest. "She's under my protection. You're not touching her." "Your protection," Sterling sneered, looking around at the small cabin, the modest corral. "What can you possibly offer her?" "I'm offering her a chance to work off her debt. It's a matter of business. Now send her out." This was the moment Arthur had been dreading. He was not a fighter. He owned a rifle for hunting, but he was no gunman. Sterling's men were big, and their hands rested near the pistols on their hips. But as he stood there on his own land, a different kind of strength rose in him, one born of conviction. "You're trespassing, Sterling," Arthur said calmly. "This land is mine, filed and recorded under the Homestead Act of '62. The deed is in that cabin. If you set one foot on it without my permission, you'll be answering to the U.S. Marshal in Carson City." Sterling's smile faltered. He had expected bluster, fear, perhaps a clumsy threat. He had not expected a quiet, firm recitation of territorial law. He had always dismissed Hayes as a nobody, a dirt scratcher with a few broken-down horses. But the man standing before him was not intimidated. He was citing federal law. As the standoff tightened, the cabin door opened. May stepped out onto the porch. She had heard the raised voices. She held a heavy black cast-iron skillet in her right hand, gripping its handle tightly. She didn't look afraid. Her eyes were fixed on Sterling, and they held a cold fire that surprised even Arthur. She said nothing, but her presence was a clear declaration. She was not hiding. She was standing with him. The sight of the small woman in the gray dress, armed with a piece of kitchen iron, standing beside the quiet rancher, was so unexpected that one of Sterling's men let out a short, choked laugh. The tension broke. Sterling stared at them, his face a mask of cold fury. This was not going as planned. Publicly manhandling a woman, even a foreign one, with Hayes citing the law, could bring the wrong kind of attention. It was untidy. "This isn't over, Hayes," Sterling snarled, pulling the reins of his horse. "That woman has a debt to pay. One way or another, I'll collect." He wheeled his horse around and rode off, his men following. The dust settled, leaving a profound silence in its wake. The immediate danger had passed, but Arthur knew Sterling was not a man who let things go. He had won the skirmish, but the real trouble was just beginning. As he turned to go back to the corral, his eyes caught a glint of white paper on the ground where Sterling's horse had stood. He walked over and picked it up. It was a folded telegraph message, dropped in the heat of the moment. He smoothed it out, his brow furrowing as he read the clipped, impersonal words. He did not yet know that the flimsy piece of paper in his hand held the key to the entire lie. A truth far uglier than a simple, unpaid debt. That evening, the air in the small cabin was thick with unspoken things. The confrontation had changed the dynamic between them. They were no longer just a man and the stranger he had taken in. They were allies, bound by a common enemy. The silence was no longer awkward, but charged with a shared sense of peril. After a simple meal of beans and cornbread, Arthur placed the folded telegraph message on the table between them. "Sterling dropped this," he said, pushing it toward her. May looked at the paper, then at him. She couldn't read the English script, but she recognized the official look of the telegraph form. Arthur watched her, then made a decision. He had to know the full truth, and she deserved to know it too. He slowly read the words aloud, his voice flat. "To J. Sterling, Redemption Gulch. From Agent Clay, San Francisco. Stop. Groom took payment. Stop. Boarded eastbound train alone. Stop. Consignment abandoned as discussed. Stop. Awaiting instructions. Stop." He let the words hang in the quiet room. Consignment abandoned as discussed. The phrase was cold, clinical, and utterly damning. This wasn't a surprise to Sterling. It was a plan. May stared at the paper, then at Arthur's face, searching for meaning. He saw the confusion in her eyes. He tapped the paper. "Your husband," he said, struggling for the right word. "He was paid. Paid to leave you here." He pointed east. "Train. Gone." Then he pointed at the name on the telegraph. Sterling. He planned this. Understanding dawned on her face, followed by a wave of such profound humiliation and pain that Arthur had to look away. Her entire journey, the marriage, the promises, it was all a calculated business transaction designed to deliver her, isolated and indebted, into Jedediah Sterling's hands. She wasn't a bride who had been abandoned. She was cargo that had been delivered. She reached into a small cloth bundle she kept beside her cot and pulled out two things. The first was the worthless marriage contract. The second was a small, worn English to Chinese dictionary. She placed the contract on the table next to the telegraph. She looked at Arthur, her eyes clear and dark. She pointed to the contract, then to herself, and spoke one perfectly pronounced English word. "Sold." The word was a confession and an accusation. It laid bare the whole rotten truth. Arthur felt a fresh surge of anger at Sterling, at the casual cruelty of the man. He had thought he was helping a woman in a bad spot. He now understood he had stumbled into a fight against something far more sinister. But then May did something he did not expect. Her expression hardened, the look of a victim replaced by something steely and resolute. She picked up the dictionary and began flipping through the thin pages, her finger tracing lines of characters. It took her a full minute. Finally, she stopped, her finger resting on a single word. She pushed the book across the table to him and pointed. The word was fight. A grim smile touched Arthur's lips. "All right," he said softly. "We fight." The fight came to them sooner than they expected. 2 days later, when Arthur rode into town for supplies, a notice was nailed to the door of the land office. It was a legal document, a notice of lien filed by Jedediah Sterling against the property of Arthur Hayes. The reason cited was the harboring of a debtor's asset valued at $500. The supposed cost of May's passage and contract. Sterling was using the law itself as a club, twisting it to legitimize his claim. He wasn't just coming for May anymore. He was coming for Arthur's ranch. The town, which had been watching with detached curiosity, began to choose sides. Sterling was a powerful man. He controlled credit at the general store and offered the best prices for freight. When Arthur went to buy flour and coffee, the proprietor, a man he'd known for years, suddenly found it difficult to meet his eye. "Sorry, Arthur," he mumbled. "Can't extend you any more credit. Sterling's orders." It was the same everywhere. Men who had greeted him last week now nodded curtly and walked away. The weight of the community was turning against him. He was no longer just a quiet rancher. He was a troublemaker, an outsider who was disrupting the town's delicate balance of power. That evening, his nearest neighbor, a practical farmer named Peterson, rode over. "Arthur," he said, getting straight to the point, "I saw the notice. You know what Sterling is like. He'll ruin you. He'll tie you up in court until you've got nothing left to pay the lawyer, and then he'll take your land. Just give him the woman. It ain't your fight." Arthur listened, staring out at the hills turning purple in the twilight. Peterson was right. It was the sensible thing to do. He could save his ranch, the land he had poured his sweat and blood into for a decade. All he had to do was turn his back on the woman in his cabin. He could go back to his quiet life. He could be safe. He thought of May, of the quiet dignity with which she had swept his floor, of the fierce look in her eyes when she'd held up that skillet, of the way she had pointed to that one word in the dictionary: fight. He had given his word, not just to her, but to himself. He turned to his neighbor. "I appreciate the advice, Peterson, but I can't do that." Peterson shook his head, a look of pity on his face. "You're a fool, Hayes." He rode off, leaving Arthur alone with his decision. The choice had a terrible clarity. It would cost him something he could not get back. If he fought Sterling and lost, he would lose his home, his livelihood, his place in the world. But if he gave May up, he would lose something far more essential. He would lose himself. He walked back into the cabin. May was at the table, trying to read a page from an old almanac by the light of a kerosene lamp, her dictionary beside her. She looked up as he entered, her expression questioning. "I have to go to Carson City," he said slowly, making sure she understood. "To see the marshal. The law." He saddled his best horse, a sturdy buckskin that could handle the long ride. It was a 3-day journey each way, a week in total if he was lucky. A week where she would be here, alone and vulnerable. It was a tremendous risk for both of them. He was betting everything on the hope that the law was more than just a tool for powerful men like Sterling. He was betting his future on a piece of paper and the integrity of a stranger. As he mounted his horse, May came out onto the porch. She handed him a small bundle, bread and dried meat for the journey. Their eyes met over the small offering. No words were needed. He was risking his land for her, and she was trusting him with her life. He nodded once, then turned the horse and rode into the growing darkness. 3 months later, the punishing heat of summer had finally broken, giving way to the crisp, clean air of a Nevada autumn. The aspens in the high country were turning a brilliant gold, and the long shadows of morning stretched across a changed landscape at Arthur Hayes's ranch. The notice of lien was gone, not just from the town's records, but from the minds of its people. The U.S. Marshal had indeed come to Redemption Gulch. He was a tall, imposing man with a weary face and eyes that missed nothing. He had listened to Arthur's story, examined the telegraph message, and then, with a translator he had brought from Carson City, he had listened to May. She told her story with a quiet, unshakable dignity. The marshal's investigation was swift and thorough. Jedediah Sterling, who had believed himself above the law, found himself bound by it. He was arrested on federal charges of human trafficking and conspiracy to defraud. His freight empire, built on bullying and intimidation, was in the hands of federal receivers. The power that had held Redemption Gulch in its grip had been broken. A spare room in Arthur's cabin was no longer just a bedroom. It had become a workshop. May had discovered that the fine, meticulous stitching she had learned as a girl in China was perfectly suited for repairing leather. She had started by mending Arthur's worn-out bridle, her stitches small, tight, and stronger than the original. Word had spread. Ranchers who had once shunned Arthur now came to him, hats in hand, asking if the missus would be willing to look at their saddles and tack. She worked with a quiet focus, her hands transforming cracked, useless leather into functional, durable equipment. She charged a fair price, and for the first time in her life, she was earning her own money. She kept the silver coins in a small wooden box Arthur had made for her, a tangible symbol of a life she was building for herself. With the water rights finally secured and the extra income from May's work, the ranch was beginning to thrive. They had bought 2 new mares and a wagon load of hay to see them through the winter. The barn roof, which had leaked for 2 years, was now solid and new. The community, always swayed by the twin tides of power and success, had reversed its judgment. Arthur was no longer a fool. He was a man of principle. May was no longer a strange outsider. She was a woman of substance and skill. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet, Arthur returned from a long day of rounding up stray cattle. He was tired down to the bone, but it was a good kind of tired. He He saw May sitting on the porch steps. She was not wearing the gray silk dress. That had been carefully folded and put away in a chest, a relic of a past life. She wore a simple cotton shirt and a pair of sturdy denim trousers she had bought for herself at the general store. In her hands was a piece of leather she was tooling with a small, sharp knife, a skill she was teaching herself. She looked up as he approached, and a smile touched her lips. It was not the hesitant, fearful expression he had first seen, but a genuine, open smile that reached her eyes. He sat down on the step beside her, the familiar scent of leather and pine filling the quiet air. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply reached out and placed his calloused hand over hers, his touch a silent acknowledgment of everything that had passed between them. He had offered a stranger a spare room, a simple act of decency in a world that had shown her none. But in the quiet days and shared struggles that followed, they had built something far more substantial. They had built a home, a place defined not by four walls or a deed on file, but by the unspoken understanding that true courage was not the absence of fear, but the simple, profound choice to stand for another when it was easiest to stand alone. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.